Welcome. My name is Virginia Lovett. I'm the Executive Director of the Melbourne Theatre Company. And welcome to our very first Melbourne Conversation in partnership with the City of Melbourne, celebrating the world premiere of David Williamson's new play, Rupert. When I first approached Jeff Taylor to curate a Melbourne Conversation for this play, I never dreamt the timing would be so aligned. 48 hours from a federal election, and the Murdoch press a major discussion topic. I would like to thank the Melbourne Theatre Company staff who have been fantastic putting this together, City of Melbourne, and the panel who you are soon to meet. And I'd like to welcome your MC for tonight, Dr Leslie Cannold. Please enjoy the evening and thank you for coming. Leslie.
Hello everyone, welcome. You're in for a fantastic evening. I want to start off by thanking Jeff Taylor of Melbourne Conversations and all the wonderful folks at the MTC for organising this inaugural event. I hope there's going to be more of them. The backdrop to tonight are two events of momentous importance. The nation's preparation to vote in the 44th Parliament of Australia this Saturday, and the opening last Thursday of David Williamson's wonderful play, Rupert. These two momentous events are not unrelated. But before I steer us onto the hard-edged themes and pressing political questions that will dominate the evening, I really want to congratulate David and the MTC on this brilliantly written and wonderfully staged production, which I had the pleasure of seeing on Friday. It left me feeling enervated in the way induced by good theatre and not a bit envious. Such envy should make good my claim that I am also a writer, or at least on good days like to say that I am one. But as a writer who constantly switches forms, I move from academic prose to columns to non-fiction books to novels and then back again. I found Rupert to be an advertisement for sticking to what you know. It really was a tour de force of someone so entirely across the rules of the genre, he could break them with aplomb and make it work, work, work. If you haven't seen it, you're really making a big mistake. And I mean that truly. So that's all I have to say about that. Tonight, our focus will be on the themes that are raised by David Williamson's play, Rupert. We're going to talk about the economic decline of Australia's traditional media players and its impact on public interest journalism. We're going to slap the hindquarters of long-standing press ideals of objectivity, balance, and the right of reply and let them jog around the track. We're going to discuss media concentration, self-regulation, and that hoary old chestnut of making power accountable. We're going to discuss the rise of the networked fourth estate and ask what it and other disruptive technologies portend for the very survival of Australian democracy. That ought to keep us off the streets for a few hours. So, let me get to the artists and experts who will take us on this exciting intellectual journey. I'll get them to come up and take their seats as I introduce them. So first I'd like to introduce Stephen Mayne. Stephen, will you come out? Stephen is the founder of Crikey, a shareholder activist and a Melbourne City Councillor. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Margaret Simons. Margaret is a journalist, a writer, and director of the Centre for Advanced Journalism at the University of Melbourne. And of course, I would like to introduce David Williamson, who you all probably know, Australian playwright, whose previous works include Don's Party, The Removalists, The Club, Money and Friends, and Brilliant Lies, amongst others. So I want to start with David. David, as I've said, Rupert is great entertainment, but writers also write because they have something to say. So can you talk to us a little bit about why this story at this time?
Well, I did think that Rupert was an extraordinary story, and theatrically, what his story reminded me of was one of my favourite plays of all time, Shakespeare's Richard III. Richard and Rupert share a lot of characteristics in common. Richard, and the story has a lot in common. Richard starts as a little offstage hunchback who nobody takes much notice of, and by a combination of boldness, guile, deceit, utter ruthlessness, charm, he becomes King of England. Rupert starts with a failing newspaper in Adelaide of no significance and becomes the most powerful voice in the English-speaking world and the most powerful Australian-born person who has ever lived. And his story, in some ways, is even more remarkable than Richard. Richard gets his comeuppance on Boswell Field, but Rupert goes on forever. Shrugs off the Leveson inquiry, shrugs off the fact that he was caught out telling his journalists that the English police were a pack of dills. Nothing stops him, and his share price is still rising. So my first fascination was the dramatic arc of someone who is underestimated by everyone and becomes immensely powerful. I think it's a strong story, as is Richard III. How did he do it? What personality characteristics? So initially, it was less theme than character. What drove this man and what enabled him to do it?
And was there something that is it just entertainment? Because it is very entertaining, and do you want people to laugh and enjoy it and then get up and walk away and not think about it again? Or are there things you're hoping people will walk out of the theatre with?
Oh, no, Leslie. I do hope they will walk out of the theatre thinking, because along with this immense power has come an immense capacity to shape the thinking of the English-speaking world. And I think Rupert is not just someone driven by accumulating money, certainly accumulating power, but accumulating power for a reason. And he is an ideologue, a fervent ideologue for free market, non-regulation, small government, no trade union, all of that. He fervently believes that the world is a much better place for a rampant free market. And he pushes this ideology with ferocity. And I think he has actually succeeded through entities like Fox News in shifting the ideological centre of gravity to the right in all English-speaking countries, and therefore is an immensely important figure socially and politically.
And what did you feel about the report on this Monday, which was in Crikey, that the Herald Sun, which as people would know is one of the largest circulation newspapers here in Victoria, spiked a review of Rupert after what was quoted as saying management intervention?
Management intervention, yes. Not only did they spike that review, they cancelled an interview with me the day before on short notice, and they also commissioned me to write a 1,000-and-a-half piece on the genesis of the play and why I wrote it, and that's been spiked as well. I just became persona non grata, and I thought it was highly ironic, because that kind of behaviour is exactly what I'm warning against in the play. But it seems they don't compute. They are just so used to having absolute power to control the agenda of what Australia talks about that they feel they're invulnerable. And I thought it was quite extraordinary.
And so, Margaret, that kind of leads nicely into the idea of about public interest journalism and about the role of journalism. It's been said that one survey I read has ranked journalists alongside used car salespeople and, wait for it, lawyers. That's what we tend to think about journalists. But it's long been accepted by really political philosophers, by students of history, that you have to have public interest journalism if you're going to have a functioning democracy. So can you explain to us, in a kind of short, give us Politics 101 about why a free and independent media is so vital to a functioning democracy?
Well, that's an enormous question, Leslie, but it's got a pretty...
2 minutes, do it.
It's got a pretty simple answer, fortunately. People always tend to judge our own time as the constant. In fact, the role of journalism in democracy has changed over time quite substantially and is changing very fast, perhaps faster than ever before in our own time. But nevertheless, the constant is the ability to find out what's going on. more important, I think, than the active, questioning and holding to account, although that's certainly part of it and part that people tend to emphasise
Holding
now.
power to account.
Yes, but the old-fashioned notion of the journal of record was the idea that you could pick up The Age or The Times or such a paper and find out everything of importance that had happened in your society that day.
Outside of what the government, for instance, would
So
want
what
you to
happened in
know.
Parliament, what happened in the courts, what's happened in the major forums of business and so on, that you could be confident that you were well informed on the important events. And such journals tended to grow up whenever society became too big to know itself by word of mouth alone. Now, in our own time, editors are far more likely to talk about holding people to account, asking the tough questions, than they are about reporting Parliament comprehensively, whether or not it's interesting and newsworthy. So it has shifted over time, and as I say, it's shifting extremely fast right now. Perhaps we'll get to that later.
Well, what's going wrong? I mean, keep going for a minute. What's going wrong? I think there's a general sense, wherever I go, people talk about an unease with the media, and they talk about a sense that something's going wrong with our democracy, and sometimes it gets called a lack of civility, and sometimes it gets called the Americanisation of politics. Sideshow, Lindsay Tanner's book was another theory about it. But in your worldview, what is going wrong with the media, and how is that connecting up with what's going wrong with our democracy?
Well, I've been a journalist for 30 years, and in any one of those years you could have asked that question. People have always thought it was worse in their own time than it had ever been before. But there are some things which I do think are going wrong, or which could work better, and one of the big ones is the one that David's opened up for us, the concentration of media ownership in this country. It is, depending on how you count, the highest in the Western world, or one of the highest. It's certainly right up there, and that has a real impact on our democracy. It's not about whether Rupert Murdoch is a saint or a sinner, like most of us. He's a bit of both. It's that there's only one of him and that he's too powerful. That's really what it's about. So that's one of the things that's going wrong. At the same time, the advent of new technology have undermined the business model, basically classified advertising, which for most of my career has paid the journalists' wages. All these newspapers thought they were in the journalism business. In fact, they're in the classified advertising business, and as most people here know, hardly anybody looks at the classies anymore. It's all online. And that means that our main media companies, including Rupert Murdoch's media company, are in an atmosphere of crisis and downsizing. On the upside, and I do tend to be an optimist, we have better means for communicating and for sharing news and information in our own time than any human society has ever had before. And the potential of that is immense. But we're at a period which I like to compare to the 50 or 60 years after the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. Power relationships are shifting very fast. The Pope's getting a bit worried. The books are important enough to begin to burn them. Ideas of the public are beginning to grow up, that is, people who don't know each other but share common concerns because they're reading published material. Martin Luther's posting his stuff on the doors of churches. Christopher Columbus is being remembered as the discoverer of the Americas. Forget the Vikings, they didn't publish their accounts. And we are living at a time of equivalent opportunity and threat.
Which both, I'd imagine, which is what you're alluding to, are really coming from the internet. So in fact, the business model is collapsing because of the internet.
Primarily the internet, also digital broadcasting and digital technology generally, but yes, primarily.
The digital communications, and also the opportunities are coming that way. So Stephen, this probably is a good point to bring you in, because Crikey in some ways was riding that wave, wasn't it, when you created, didn't you used to call it that internet thing, or that thing on the internet?
Yeah. So, I think Crikey is a good example of let a thousand flowers bloom. Is that I used to work for the Murdochs and used to be concerned about the lack of diversity, and had particular issues about Jeff Kennett not being held to account, and set up my own website and got a few journalists to work with it, and could say what I liked. I mean, yes, I got sued and it was difficult, but.
Well, that sort of preempts my question, was what was the response of the big players?
Well, I mean, I can't get into the Herald Sun building today to go on Sky News because I can't get a security pass because Peter Blunden, the boss there, hates me because of what I said about him in 1999. So I'd be in Parliament by now, but for their ban on me. So I'm motivated to talk about them, you might say. But I'm not unhappy about the overall ability for the media. This election I'm tweeting away. The Get Up ad that got banned criticising Rupert is now up to 450,000 views on the internet. It would have been a lot more sensible for the Murdoch interests to not lobby the free-to-airs to ban this. So there's an old world mentality, we can control everything, but you can't. So I'm more upbeat about the social media and the diversity that comes from ABC News 24 and Sky News and Guardian Australia and Crikey and The Conversation. And so I'm upbeat, but I still think that what Rupert has done this election campaign is a disgrace. It's the most amazing bias I've ever seen. And sure, many will argue the government deserved to lose, but I think the best way to measure it is this, that if Rupert had done to Tony Abbott what he's done to Kevin Rudd, Labor would get a third term. So in a system of compulsory voting, where you've only got to shift the dial 2 or 3 percentage points, 60% of the press going absolutely feral as front-page propagandists day after day, that does shift the dial and change the government. And I don't think one person in New York who's not even allowed to vote in Australia should be allowed to unilaterally decide he's going to deploy his power in an unprecedented way to change the government.
But I think this might be, I mean, I agree with everything Stephen just said, but I think this might be the last election on which that can happen.
Why?
Because I think
Why?
that
Yes, we want to know why. Why?
Because I think it's undoubtedly the case that the mainstream media, in which Rupert is overwhelmingly dominant, still has the reach, far more reach than social media, but it is changing extremely fast. And Stephen's just given a couple of examples of things which the mainstream media have tried to suppress, such as the Get Up ad, which have nevertheless been seen by just about everybody who's interested, I suspect. Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, which was universally dismissed by the Canberra Press Gallery, has now been viewed by an audience of millions around the world.
But isn't it all about illusion to some degree? Because the other day on the media report, the AFR journalist and media watcher Neil Chenoweth was basically saying that, look, the reality is Abbott was going to win this election anyway. But by being so biased, and Media Watch did a very kind of dispassionate analysis that really was conclusive around the Telegraph, for instance, being very biased towards Labor, he will be able to kind of run this game, and by tweeting, he'll basically be able to run that game that he did in 1992 where he ran that headline, which is in Rupert.
Yes.
The Sun, what won it?
The Sun, what won it, yeah.
So he can claim credit for, in fact, what he didn't have power to deliver. It would have been delivered anyway, and then expect a quid pro quo.
Yeah. Rupert picks winners. I mean, you can see that right across his career. He picks winners. Now, does he create winners, or does he just pick the one who was going to win anyway? I suspect a bit of both. I don't think there's any doubt, as Stephen says, that the sort of front-page publicity still has the power to turn an election. I don't think there's any doubt at all.
And after all your research...
Absolutely. Well, in the play, the 1992 election, in which Neil Kinnock, 3 weeks out, was 7 to 10 points ahead in the opinion polls, Kinnock was threatening to limit the scope of Murdoch media in England. Kinnock thought he had far too much and was going to act on it. The Murdoch press went to town, the Sun went to town, and they perfected a weapon he's still using with great effect, and that's ridicule. If you want to discredit a politician, use ridicule. Put them in a funny German hat or do something like that. Make them seem like lesser human beings and idiots, and you will get what you want. And they're still using that technique now.
And the demolition of Neil Kinnock got Tony Blair to Hayman Island to deal, kept the UK out of Europe, and had no industrial relations reform at all in the UK, and got the UK into Iraq.
But what does he want here in Australia? So I think what all of us would like to know is if he's running that strategy because he really does exercise the power, or he's creating the illusion he does, what does he want? NBN? Restrictions on the ABC? What is it? What does he want?
Well, I think he hates public broadcasters wherever he is, because he's fundamentally a bit of a monopolist. He very much is motivated in destroying his competitors. So he's not a competition guy. He wants to destroy everyone. He's very motivated to destroy CNN through Fox News, to destroy the Mirror, to destroy Fairfax. So ultimately he wants to dominate the conversation, be very wealthy, influence Western governments and not have strong competitors. That's his goal.
And do you have a view about that?
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And he wants to foist his ideology on the world. It's not just a matter of being a bully boy. He wants to use it to some purpose, and that is to propagate his extreme free market views. And he regards himself, I think he honestly regards himself as someone, as a great benefactor of the world, because he points to the fact that the world poverty levels, extreme poverty levels, have decreased from 55% to about 20% in the last 30 years, and he attributes that to free market mechanisms working in China and India, and there's some truth in that. I don't doubt there's some truth, but the other side of the extreme free market zero regulation is what we've just seen in the world financial crisis, where rapacious and unprincipled financial operators nearly brought the world to its knees, then were bailed out by public money and are now earning as much as ever. So what an unrestricted free market does is make those at the very top end extremely wealthy and increase the disparity between wealth and poverty.
His predictions are not always correct, though. I mean, he told the bulletin before the Iraq invasion that let's invade Iraq and we'll get a $20 oil barrel price, and that'll be like a tax cut for everyone. And then when the oil price got to 150, I asked him at the AGM, what happened to your $20? And he said, oh, China grew too fast. Sorry about that one. But, this is a guy who can start wars. I mean, he was the fourth member of the Coalition of the Willing. Australia would not have gone to war but for every single Murdoch paper here saying, go, Johnny, go.
But let's go back to the idea of concentration, because I think it's nice to have a kind of figure, a face to kind of a problem. But is it really, can we really say that the problem here is this one man, and it isn't a sideshow phenomenon, it isn't the drying up of the rivers of gold, it isn't self-regulation? If you think about the Finkelstein report, there was a discussion of media concentration, but there were many, many other things that were discussed in terms of the problems with the Australian media. Surely it can't be as simple as just one man.
No, of course it isn't. It's a complex fabric. But it's not just one man, it is the corporate culture that has grown up under that one man. And the sort of ethical issues and the attitudes towards ethics that grow up in newsrooms are one aspect of that culture. Now, News Limited, as a journalist, I've worked for News Limited in my time, and many of my friends work there now. There's many things that's admirable about that culture. I think compared to Fairfax, for example, they've got an extraordinary ability to prioritise journalism, to pursue news. There's many positive aspects to the culture, but there is an extraordinary blindness to their own failings and an extraordinary unwillingness to seriously engage in debate about their own failings. And it's really like, they're all part of a rugby team or something. They're all singing the same song and wearing the jersey.
But isn't the answer to that regulation? I just want to push this a little bit harder, because we do have this problem where we have a media collectively. So the Finkelstein report, which was, in the wake of the hacked off scandal in the UK, we had a report here looking into our media. And the Finkelstein report said, look, everybody agrees on a whole bunch of stuff. The media is powerful. It needs to conform to a whole bunch of standards about integrity, fairness, accuracy, balance. But what couldn't be agreed upon is actually how to make those standards enforceable. Because at the moment, the culture is saying, and all of the media is saying this, not just the Murdoch press, is saying we have to be self-regulated because any other regulation, it means the end of the free press and democracy as we know it. Is that really true?
Well, I'm very much in favour of freedom of speech, and am prepared to put up with a great deal in order to preserve it, including bias and inaccurate reporting. I do think it is incredibly important. However, I don't think it is inconsistent with the approach which various people in this debate, Finkelstein, Leveson, others, Conroy most recently, have suggested, which is self-regulation to which you have to join up. So if you want to be in the mass media business, you must join up to a self-regulation scheme that meets certain standards, and then leave all the rest of it, how it actually runs, who hands out the bouquets and the brickbats, mostly brickbats. Leave all of that to the industry, but you must be part of it. That, I think, is a reasonable point to strike the balance.
But it went down. So, Stephen, why do you think it went down?
Well, I mean, the Murdoch press ran a massive campaign against it and went to war with the government for even suggesting this, and really personal attacks on Justice Finkelstein as well.
Not only Murdoch, it should be said, Kerry Stokes and Fairfax Media
but
as well.
I think the choir master was the Murdoch press. So, I think that in the age of the internet, that genie is so well and truly out of the bottle of fear of authoritarian dictatorship and oppression that there is no risk of that. So that's why I'm a supporter of greater regulation. I mean, at the end of the day, the culture issue is very true. I started working at the Herald Sun 2 years after Rupert bought it, and it was a very good journalistic culture. And then 5 years later, I went to the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, which Rupert had since 1972, and it was an absolutely cowboy, blokey, unethical culture. So the difference between the two cities was amazing. So it is fundamentally, in my view, a cultural issue. There's been a failure by the board of News Corp and the shareholders to have basically a moral compass or an ethical standard. And that goes back to the Australian regulators in 1993 allowing Rupert to set up a gerrymander that would make Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen blush, where 70% of the shares don't get a vote. So this is a guy who owns 13% of the company, but 40% of the votes. So you can't, because he's thoroughly undemocratic in that regard. So the normal mechanisms of accountability through ownership and directors isn't there because he's gamed the rules in a thoroughly undemocratic way and should never have been allowed to do that.
But can I read you a quote from Murdoch himself, okay? This is Murdoch on media diversity from ABC Media Watch back in the days. I think the days are 1967, okay? Check it. Okay, I think the important thing is that there be plenty of newspapers with plenty of different people controlling them so that there's a variety of viewpoints. So there's a choice for the public. This is the freedom of the press that is needed. Freedom of the press mustn't be one-sided just for a publisher to speak as he pleases to try and bully the community. So I think what he's saying there is what I know you say, Margaret, which is that we worry a lot about this man, but we worry a lot about him because the structural problem is he controls too much of the media. There's too much concentration. So should we worry less about him and worry more about expanding and deconcentrating our media?
Well, look, it's hard not to worry about Rupert given the present position. Yes, that's a good aim to do all that, but how is it done? I mean, the thing that strikes me as really extraordinary about the Murdoch culture worldwide and in particular in Australia is how belligerent and bully boy the tone is. On the one hand, they lash out with ferocity and ferocious criticism at every critic they have. Then they tell Mr Rudd, who dares to mention that their treatment of the Labor Party has been biased, to just move on, forget all that, don't whinge, don't whine. But if anyone dares to question News Limited, their attack dogs go into berserk, full rage. They use editorials in a way that editorials have never been used in Australia before, to personally attack, to denigrate. There's just a tone about the Murdoch press that's worrying.
So what's going to happen to all of us?
We're going to get attacked. You've already been attacked, whether you knew it or not. But this is the Murdoch press has declared this a totally biased panel of. So we should have had two Murdoch editors here with us. But I love the way they insist on ABC lack of bias, and according to the Murdoch press, the ABC is a pack of left-wing vipers. And they insist on balance all the time. Well, where has the balance been in the Murdoch press lately? Yeah.
And what about, I want to go back a little bit to the electronic fourth estate and the opportunities of the media in terms of the digital media. So is that part of the answer to this quandary about diversity? Are we looking in the wrong direction? Are we thinking very concretely about we need more, media proprietors to come in and take over the old established media, which really in some ways is fragmenting and is probably not going to be a institution that lasts? Do we need to be thinking about more innovative ideas about how journalism can be done?
Well, those two aren't mutually exclusive, and if I could just backtrack a little bit, you're asking sort of who's to blame a little bit earlier on. We mustn't forget government, and those who've got time for Paul Keating should not forget that it was Keating's media policies, the princes of print and queens of the screen legislation, which allowed Murdoch to become so completely dominant in the Australian context. I think it's one of the huge blemishes on Keating's record, and we've all been paying for it ever since.
Every politician will grovel and pragmatically deal with the media owner of the day for a short-term favourable coverage. So Keating and Hawke wanted to take out the Herald and Weekly Times because they ran an aggressive campaign against the capital gains tax, which was introduced in 1985. They were the old sort of Melbourne club establishment house. John Howard allowed foreign ownership with Steve Fielding's vote, and so that legitimised Murdoch's dominant foreign position in the Australian media. Stephen Conroy, for all his hot air, said nothing when $2 billion was paid by Foxtel to buy Austar, and another $2 billion was paid by News Corp to buy James Packer's media rump to develop an entire pay TV monopoly in Australia, all on Conroy's watch. And Conroy said nothing when Lachlan Murdoch buys 9% of Channel 10, appoints himself CEO and then executive chairman, and hires Andrew Bolt. And so Conroy, it's all very...
But then you get Lindsay Tanner complaining about this very environment that you're saying the politicians themselves, through their own cowardice or stupidity, have created. So how does that work?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Lindsay Tanner said about political reporting specifically.
So people
in this
know
country,
Lindsay Tanner's book Sideshow?
But he does let the politicians off the hook a bit. And, it annoys me that people focus too much on what the politicians of today are doing about these issues and forget, or the record of, Keating and Hawke in particular, which I think was a key moment, an absolutely key moment in the history of our democracy, and they're largely let off the hook for it these days. They should not be.
But it's not just a question of blame. In other words, there's a confusion, it seems to me, like if politicians are going to go about setting up situations where the media is so concentrated that they really have to cater, as they feel they do now, to Murdoch, that actually isn't really in their interest, is it?
Well, they often think it's in their short-term interest, as Stephen has pointed out. Keating thought that countering the present regime in the Herald Sun would be beneficial, that Murdoch was a better option. Then it turns like a viper on him in the long term. So often they go for short-term solutions which are going to help them in the immediate moment, that leave us with long-term media distortions which do in some sense threaten democracy itself, because when you get politicians dancing momentarily to the tune to get a bit of favourable coverage, then they don't really control the country.
Well, Billy McMahon knew he would lose the 72 election the day that Sir Frank Packer sold the Daily Telegraph to Rupert Murdoch for $15 million in the car park after they'd been to the boxing together. Right. Because Rupert was a lefty and Sir Frank Packer was absolutely, devoted to the Liberals. Clyde Packer was a Liberal MP for a bit there, and so he said, "I'm gone now." And Rupert, wrote the ads for the Whitlam campaign. He was like almost advertising director of the 72 Whitlam campaign, and then so Whitlam loved it. It was the best thing that ever happened to Whitlam, was Sir Frank Packer getting taken out. Then, of course, he flipped 3 years later and ran a vicious campaign against Whitlam in 75. So it was on the right side. What he said went in both those elections.
So it's just a short-termism. So I feel like we've depressed everybody significantly. We're feeling a little down now. Okay, so we're going to ride up a little bit. I'm just going to ask each of you to talk in positive terms about what we can do to solve these conundrums, and no physical harm can come to anybody in any of these solutions. So we need to think about, for instance, I'd love some comment on the Finkelstein solution, which was I think the Free Press Council, is that what it was called?
News Media Council.
The News Media Council, that's right. That would be one interesting to talk about. Another thing would be interesting to talk about is the networked fourth estate and how we can use more innovative ideas about diverse publications and voices to break the monopoly and concentration, and whatever other brilliant solutions you can come up with. Stephen, go.
Well, I'm upbeat about Twitter and social media. I mean, I saw Ray Finkelstein the other night at an MSO gig, and, he was commenting that the government did absolutely nothing with his report. So I don't think we can talk up. It was a great report, incredibly detailed and great information, but nothing has actually happened in a regulatory sense because of it. We do have a much stronger press council now. So the publishers, a bit like with Whitlam back in 75, the press council was established to fend off government regulation. So industries will always do self-regulation to stop the government coming in. So the Press Council is a much stronger beast now. It's better funded. It's got more independent people. So that's certainly a positive that we're seeing. The codes of conduct are now all on the website and out there. I mean, I think they're being blatantly ignored in terms of the idea of balance. But I just think the other thing is that...
It's not enforceable. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, it's being funded by media organisations that can pull out their funding when they're not
can't now.
3 to 5 year firm funding.
Right, okay. So that whole idea of it being self-funded...
The Press Council's been substantially reformed and it's no longer possible for publishers to pull out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but basically the Internet, Guardian Australia, I mean, I can't see too many positives in the way this election campaign has run. I guess the biggest positive I'd say is there's no such thing as a good third-term government, and probably it's healthy for the Labor Party to go out anyway, and hopefully the Murdoch press will take it to Abbott the way they took it to Ted Baillieu. I mean, Ted Baillieu got massacred by the Murdoch press basically because he wasn't seen as action man. Rupert they normally back more hard right people. Ted was too progressive, and he was uncomfortable in the media space and never put the Herald Sun on the drip with daily scoops and all this sort of stuff. So it wasn't before long they backed him losing. So hopefully the press will go back to being pretty vigorous in taking on the government after this Saturday. It's just a pretty tawdry period we've just been through in the last few weeks, that's all.
Well, again, the suggestion from Neil Chetwynd was that the new model that the Murdoch press may be adopting is no longer talking about the future being digital, but rather going back to a very old-fashioned idea of print for a narrow audience, the same kind of audience that the shock jocks are targeting, so an older audience, conservative audience, and lots of ridicule and lots of lampooning and lots of giving it hard to the government of the day, whoever the government of the day is.
Well, I think so, but the other point is dead tree journalism is dying, and Rupert is delaying releasing his profit results at the moment because he's separated out his print business from his lucrative electronic business. So the print business is only worth about 10 billion. It can no longer sustain the two largest loss-making newspapers in the world, the New York Post and the Times. The Australian businesses are collapsing. He's obviously arguing with his auditors about the size of the write-down. So there's a massive crisis about huge losses in the world's biggest newspaper business, which is News Corp. And in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll see billion-dollar losses, and they have damaged themselves through this last period as well. So I think it is probably the last hurrah, I think, of an election where newspapers will have this amazing role, and therefore there's an upside from that the dominant monopolistic medium is in systemic decline.
Okay, Margaret, some solutions?
Okay, well, I'll just concentrate on one. I do think there is enormous hope in the fact that anybody with access to a computer and the internet can publish to the world within minutes of doing so. We're the first human society for whom that has ever been true.
However accurate or impartial.
There is great threat in there and great danger, but also enormous opportunity, just as there was with the printing press. And so I think that is a source of extraordinary hope. And I'm bolstered in this. I spent a fair bit of time in China over the last 18 months or so. Now, there is no monopolistic media proprietor like the Chinese Communist Party, and social media there is transforming the politics of China. We tend to think we're big social medias in Australia. In terms of our region, compared to Indonesia, compared to Malaysia, compared to China, we are actually real laggards in use of social media, and it is transforming the politics of our region. I think it is already the case that if you wish to be a really well-informed and engaged individual, you must be online, and I would urge anybody here who isn't to make the effort to get online.
We would be tweeting tonight if it weren't for the fact that no tweets can exit this technological vacuum.
And that's going to become increasingly the case. It does mean that it is possible, and this is where the propaganda from the News Corporation organisation is true, it is possible to access a wide diversity of information, but you have to go and look at it for it. You can no longer rely on a newspaper for a whole variety of reasons. You can no longer rely on the newspaper on your doorstep to do that for you.
Can you imagine how good it would be if Rupert took on the Chinese dictators? I mean, he's never turned his power in a determined way to running a campaign for democracy and free speech in China. I mean, I love it when he takes on good causes, but he just too often he's beating up on minorities and this sort of stuff, and I'd love to see him take on the democracy project more broadly in China.
He was quoted on China, and I think I've used a bit in the play, where he is exasperated with his inability to crack the Chinese market. And he said, if this was a democracy, I'd get in there, buy up the press and make them do
So David, what do you see as the solutions, having buried yourself in the problems for so long to write this play?
Well, look, I'd like to be optimistic and say that the wonders of the internet are going to broaden our ability to communicate and disseminate information, and I'm sure that's partly true. I'm sure it'll be the total demise of print journalism won't happen immediately, and I still think it's an agenda setter out there. I think internet may be growing, but it's still a minority. And the other worrying thing about the model of the internet is that the traditional model of democracy is that good arguments are put in depth by good people. We sit and take in those arguments, and on a rational basis we choose which one, and that's democracy. We go for it. In fact, research shows that once we have adopted an ideology for whatever reason, it's almost impossible for facts and arguments to change our... and so we seek out the internet sites which support our ideology and ignore the sites that have a contrary argument. So we become cocooned in our own little internet world which supports everything we believe in.
But what if our ideology is evidence?
Well, there might be a few people with that ideology that actually want to... look, evidence is... there are so many complex issues that bedevil our society, and they really take concentration to come on, to get on top of. The NBN being one. Is the Liberal model workable? Is the Labor model far superior? You really have to get deeply into the arguments to assess that, and people often haven't got the stamina to do that. So they fall back on an ideology and say anything the Labor government does is wrong, everything the Liberals do is wonderful, and that's as far as they take it.
One of the things I'm most upbeat about is, particularly in the US, is the whole movement for data release. So governments that are releasing information voluntarily. So Gavin Newsom, the former mayor of San Francisco, Robert Doyle gave me his book the other week, and he's an inspiration for politicians all over the world, which is you don't need freedom of information laws. They really are freedom from information. As politicians, we just must release everything and let the public decide. Don't rely on the journalists. And I look at the progress we've seen on things like disclosure of executive pay. The world is moving very much for more information disclosure. And at the City of Melbourne, when I've got 4 public question times a month, audio of the meetings on audio of discussions on council meeting on the website. We've got disclosing our lease register. We're about to disclose all our land valuations. And if that movement gains traction and more political people agree to just release everything, then the worry about needing 600 investigative journalists to dig out every last fact after a night on the grog in some bar with some bureaucrat
Speak for yourself.
Or buying the information.
But the massive effort needed to intelligently sift through that massive information requires that we do have experts who are relatively unbiased, that unpick that massive information for us and make it digestible for us, so we can actually come up with.
And journalists are some of those people, but they're not the only ones. Already, many of the most penetrating blogs on things like public opinion polls and records and so on are staffed not by journalists but by academics and other kinds of experts, as well as journalists. But I think, I want to take the long view. I think we're constantly at danger of underestimating the quantum of the change we're going through. We talk about the importance of journalism to a modern democracy. There was no democracy possible before the printing press was invented.
And why is that?
Because there was no public in the sense that we use the word today. That is, people who don't know each other, who are geographically remote from each other, sharing a sense of community and nationhood. That is a product of the printing press. It's a product of the technology. It took about 200 years after the invention for the first journalists and the first newspapers to begin to be created. You know, all these things that we're talking about, we're assuming these things, democracy and what we mean by democracy, is going to stay here and it's going to stay relatively fixed while the media technology moves around it. That's not going to happen. The whole thing is moving. It's going to take a few hundred years, but the whole thing is moving. None of these words that we're using as though they have fixed meanings will mean quite the same in 50 years as they do now. And that is both very frightening and very exciting.
Absolutely.
Yes, but in 50 years I'll be dead.
And so will I.
That's not cheery. Remember, we're on an upbeat.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the media landscape that you've described in Australia at this time, with the high concentration of media and the threat to our democracy, the existence of an independent public broadcaster becomes critical. Yet the ABC has never been more endangered. As you've alluded to tonight, the ABC is a threat to the Murdoch media. They see it as a competitor for its audiences, i.e. its profits. The Murdochs have made clear that they would like to see public broadcasting here and in other countries scaled back. They've expressed an interest to have parts of public broadcasters outsourced to the commercial sector, along with public funds, of course. We've seen a campaign run in this country where the Murdoch media has favoured a party that looks to be the incoming government. If it is, presumably it owes much to the Murdochs. And what I'm wondering is, what can we expect in return? And I guess more to Stephen, because he's a political strategist as well, are the public going to know, with the rest of the media also seeing the ABC as a competitor in modern times and being downsized with a smaller number of journalists, are the public going to be informed? Is the ABC really going to be privatised through the front door as the IPA have requested, or will the reality be that it will be just outsourced and its funding eroded so that we don't realise what's happening, just like the frog in the pot of boiling water?
Well, look, Tony Abbott has undertaken to retain the current funding for the ABC through the forward estimate. So if there's going to be an ideological attack and a funding reduction for the ABC, it won't happen in the first term. I'm quite upbeat about the position of the ABC. Its footprint has never been bigger. Its online presence, social media presence, the ability to listen to The World Today, AM, PM, the complete archives they've got, ABC News online, the incredible network of radio stations they have. I mean, I reckon in 15 years of being banned by the Herald Sun, I've done over 1,000 interviews on radio stations, ABC radio stations all over Australia. So I say thank God for the ABC. I think their footprint's never been bigger. As long as the funding is there, then that is the number one thing. And I think it is so loved, I cannot see, it's like Medicare. I can't see a future government having you go, John Howard stacked the board with all his mates, from Michael Kroger and Ron Brunton and all these, Keith Windshuttle, all these unbelievable ABC haters, did not make one jot of difference to the performance of the ABC, because you can't find 1,000 journalists who hate the ABC to work for it. All you can find is 4 or 5 ideologues who sit on the board who get completely ignored. As long as you fund it, it'll be fine.
I agree. I think public broadcasters around the world have never been stronger.
But what about the attack of James? Hasn't James Murdoch actually directly gone after
Yes,
the
he
BBC?
has, but he's failed. Noticeably failed. The BBC, for example, well, there were some changes in policy, but the BBC is so enormous now that it's become one of 2 or 3 global media brands. The ABC has its biggest fans in exactly the rural and regional and conservative electorates that any coalition government needs to have.
The Nats love the ABC.
One of the changes that Conroy did manage to get through, just on the sly, is a change to the ABC charter such that its online offerings now are also protected, just as its broadcast offerings are. There is always the threat of cuts to funding, and it wouldn't be the first time that that has happened, but certainly Malcolm Turnbull is a big ABC fan, has said that he's not interested in cutting. Abbott is committed to not doing it in his first term. I actually don't think we're at a time where the threat to the ABC is an urgent one.
You know, it's even doing commentary now. The Drum is a commentary site. I mean, under John Howard, that would have been never have started. It would have been attacked uphill and down dale, just like Richard Alston did those, Iraq war biased coverage attacks on the ABC. So the fact they're now doing commentary, where you can get, 1,000 words, you can rant on. I've done Murdoch rants on the ABC Drum website, so I think it's fantastic for diversity.
I can appreciate the criticisms of Murdoch, given that who the play is about, and the concerns around power and stuff, but isn't partly to blame the non-questioning, non-sceptical, non-critical thinking parts of the public that may be socially conditioned to believe what rhetorically trained journos are writing?
David?
I definitely agree, absolutely, that an organisation with rhetorically trained journalists is very good at imposing a worldview that is accepted. For instance, when you ask people, how unequal do you think Australia is? What do you think that the wage of a CEO compared with an ordinary worker is? They vastly underestimate the inequality, because the general tone of a conservative press is that we're all doing well, we're all fabulously well off, aren't we happy, isn't this economy delivering for us? Well, it's not, but that kind of uncritical acceptance of we're all happy in one ship dominates the Australian media landscape.
If you want to criticise the public, then I think the very high ratings of Today Tonight and A Current Affair is Exhibit A. Exhibit B is the influence of Alan Jones and the absolute rubbish that he puts out there. But think about the last 5 or 6 years and the dominance of breakfast television and chat shows, and how quite a few politicians now are on there on a regular basis. So the old yarn event interviewing Hawkey on A Current Affair, yes, we've lost that, but we've gained the Sunrise chat shows thing. So I don't think it's as negative as some people would say about an inability of politicians to have conversations with big audiences. Jeff Kennett banned the 7:30 report and didn't appear once in 7 years. Kerry O'Brien did 80 interviews with John Howard, 80 interviews. So the politicians are as engaged as ever with the media, and they're popping up everywhere. It's almost too much of it in this 24-hour media cycle.
Okay, you've been a fantastic audience. Can you please join me in thanking our wonderful guests, David Williamson, Margaret Simons, and Stephen Mayne. Oh, look, a standing ovation. Fantastic.